Welcome to the lecture on the Northern High Renaissance and Reformation art. Remember, the Protestant Reformation was quite popular in northern countries. Italy was Catholic, so was France, but Germany and the Netherlands and England were not. Germany tried to stay Catholic for a while, but generally failed. There are two huge artists that are going to come out of Germany during the High Renaissance, and they are Matthias Grunewald and Albrecht Dürer. Matthias Grunewald was born in 1470. He's kind of an enigma, as we do not know a lot of specifics about his life. His art was even obscured until the late 19th century, and scholars only attribute a small number of paintings and drawings to Grunewald. What we do know is that he has a wonderful ability to depict emotion. He's also painted in a Gothic or international manner, instead of like the Italians were doing with all of their tributes to ancient Greece and whatnot. Grunewald worked on the Isenheim altarpiece for roughly 4 years. And this magnificent altarpiece was done for the monastery of St. Anthony in Isenheim, Germany. And the monastery specialized in hospital work and dealt with people that had skin diseases. When looking at this altarpiece, we first notice that it's made of many parts. It's a polyptych. This closed view is quite emotional. It causes us to be somewhat squeamish even. And if we look up close at the details of Christ's body, we're going to see some really shocking things. So let's look at some details. Here we have the up-close details of Christ's body, and he is covered in sores. Now, these sores would have been similar to the ones that the patients at this hospital were enduring. And the patients of St. Anthony's would also have been comforted by the idea that Christ knew what they went through. Essentially, they're all suffering together, and somehow that makes it better. Also notice that the hand is completely demolished upon being attached to the cross. I mean, the pain that you can see writhing through his hands, and in his facial expression, basically just given up on life. And you can see a little bit of the gangrene starting to take over in his lips and what have you. We also get this detail of the sacrificial lamb. And you can see, remember that Jesus was called a lot of things in his sacrifice. He is much like the lamb. And the lamb is bleeding into this golden chalice while carrying its crucifix as well. So it's the reminder, the premonition that Jesus will die, right here in the crucifixion scene as well. So let's go back and talk about the piece as a whole. So we have an overwhelming amount of emotion, but the overall, the central scene has all the normal cast of characters. So Jesus is there at the crucifixion, obviously. We have the Virgin Mary here in white, and John the Evangelist catching her. And then we have Mary Magdalene, who is down here on her knees, praying and mourning loudly. Across the scene, we have John the Baptist, who is pointing to Christ. And John speaks, and you can see in the writing here, it says, "He must increase, and I must decrease." And then there's the sacrificial lamb bleeding at his feet. The background of this piece is dark and moody. It helps accentuate the darkness in the crucifixion scene. There's also an eclipse at the time of Christ's death, so Grunewald is really just following biblical protocol. Now, on the left wing, we have Saint Sebastian, and he is a plague saint because of the wounds he has been shot with. After he's been shot with the arrow, the wounds that remain look similar to plague wounds. And then opposite Saint Sebastian is Saint Anthony, and Anthony is associated with healing. So together, these two support and supply those people staying in the hospital with not only a visual image, but a glimmer of hope, if you will. And then on the bottom of the polyptych, we have the lamentation scene just before Christ is put into the tomb. And John the Evangelist is holding Christ's body while the Marys continue to cry and mourn. The background is just a bit lighter, but it's still pretty gray and moody. Now, this piece would have looked like this most of the time. Only on special feast days would the altarpiece be opened. So going from an emotional and dark closed version, let's take a look and see what the inside looks like. Here we have the inside of the Eisenheim altarpiece, and this is quite different. Instead of having a lot of paintings, we actually have some sculpture. So St. Anthony is here in the center, and he is flanked by St. Jerome on the right, and then St. Augustine on the left. And this is where you can see these, elegant Gothic architectural elements that Grunwald is still using. So our saints are sitting above this base that has a depiction of Jesus and the 12 apostles. The two wings on this show stories from the life of St. Anthony. On the right here, we have the Temptation of St. Anthony, and then on the left, we have St. Paul visiting St. Anthony. Now, the monastery was dedicated to Anthony after all, so we get a lot of images from his life in this altarpiece. These paintings are much brighter and more cheerful color-wise than the closed version. Grunwald had a famous contemporary whose name was Albrecht Dürer. Albrecht Dürer was born in 1471 and is known for his linear quality in painting. While Grunwald was more focused on showing the pain and suffering, Dürer was more interested in a more literal approach to art. He wanted to show the world around him, and he was inspired by the Italian Renaissance, and after a trip to Italy, he started incorporating these styles into his own work. This self-portrait from 1498 came about after visiting Milan and seeing Da Vinci's work. He wanted to convey a confident, aristocratic gentleman. He shows himself with good posture, exhibiting proper manners. He wants the world to know he has good breeding. He also wants us to know that he is well kept and has money and takes care of himself. I mean, looking at his wardrobe choices, he is achieving just that. And he is standing inside a three-dimensional space, including a window, so we can look out onto the distant world. He captures a little bit of the Italian countryside for us. And just below the window is his iconic signature, the AD, right here. Always somewhere obvious. He always wanted people to know whose art they were looking at. It shows not only that he was proud of his work, but exceptionally confident. The greatest thing that happened in Dürer's career was the invention of the printing press. Printmaking is a cheap and effective way for artists to get their art into the hands of people. Not just wealthy people either. It also made it easy to illustrate books. And Dürer had a leg up in this respect because the process of making prints is similar to that of working in the goldsmith arts. And he was trained by his father at a young age on how to manipulate metal. As a printmaker, Dürer used two different processes, engraving and woodcuts. And prints were made by pressing a sheet of paper against the image that is covered in ink, and the paper, being slightly damp, absorbs the ink as it's put through a press. Thus, the image stays behind. Now, woodcuts are a relief process. So you start with a slab of wood sawn parallel to the grain, and then you cover the wood in a white ground. Then draw the image in ink. From there, you know what you have to carve out, the white parts. This design is left behind, or the design is left behind and is raised, and then you can ink it, and the ink has a place to stay. Engraving is a bit different. It originated in Germany in the mid-15th century, and it's what we call an intaglio process, or a carving process. First, you have a metal plate, which is usually copper, and you carve your image into the plate. The image is then inked and pressed. Each of these styles have their own special characteristics. Woodcuts have a sharp contrast between light and dark, and engravings are much more atmospheric. So looking at this print of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse from 1498, this was a part of the first book designed and published by one artist. Dürer made the book Apocalypse, which he used woodcuts to illustrate. So here we have four figures riding horses. They are arranged in a diagonal composition, and they are essentially leaving a great trail of destruction. Our first horseman, the closest to us, is Death. His skinny body is seen on a horse that is equally as skinny, in addition to himself, and he's holding a pitchfork as he tramples people. Next to Death, we have Famine, and Famine is the most prominent character and has his scales fluttering in the wind behind him. His horse is much healthier and more elegant looking than Death's anyway. Next to Famine, we have War, and War has his sword drawn above his head. And the sword creates another diagonal, which is then mimicked again by this angel up here. The last horseman is Plague, with his bow drawn. Remember, the arrows leave marks that look similar to plague sores, so that's why he is associated with this instrument. The scene is intensified by all the faces of the people that are being trampled by the riders. The sky is also quite turbulent, and all of these converging lines that shade the background adds to the dark nature of this image. My favorite example of an engraving is Melancholia for 1514. This piece was executed after his second trip to Italy, during which he became fully obsessed with the Italian Renaissance. In this piece, he has created an image of an angel overcome with melancholic attitude. This was something that most people feared, especially artists. The pose that our angel is in is that of a perplexed thinker. The iconic rest of the face on the hand, in addition to having the knees apart, is brilliantly executed. This pose is also associated with sloth, or the art of being lazy. And most people thought that melancholy is caused by your humors or your bodily fluids not being in sync. If the levels were not correct, then you could end up with some kind of state of insanity. And Dürer has brilliantly filled this space with our angel with different objects that accessorize melancholy, if you will. Our obsessive thinking angel is surrounded by all of these idle tools, like a bell that doesn't ring above his head. And then there's also this hourglass that doesn't pass time. The latter leads to nowhere. The dog is asleep. The scales aren't being used. And then we have this baby angel. The baby angel essentially is supposed to represent the chaos that children bring. In the upper left of the image, we have a bat wearing the title of the image. Now, Durer has included this bat to remind us that people who suffer from melancholy like to stay in dark places. The sky is being pierced with the sunlight, however, and that is illustrating that darkness can be overcome with the light of inspiration. All an artist needs to do to overcome their melancholy is to essentially be inspired. Our next German artist is Hans Baldengrin, a beloved pupil of Albert Dürer. Born in 1484 to a family of intellectuals, his father was a lawyer and his uncle was a doctor. Hans is the first person in his family not to get a degree, but instead he decided to study art. In 1503, he started his apprenticeship with Dürer, but by 1509 his apprenticeship had ended, but their friendship never really dwindled. Now, Green was obsessed with the world of witchcraft and alchemy. His work in printmaking was a place where he let that obsession come to life. I mean, after being trained by one of the best, Albert Dürer, using his influence to create images like the Witch's Sabbath from 1510 seems kind of without saying he would do that. So, looking at this painting or this woodcut, our setting is somewhere off the beaten path, outside of town, deep in the dark woods. And the image is complex compositionally with lots of converging diagonals and dynamic energy. The wind is carrying the smoke of the witch's brew off into the sky. And one of our witches is actually up here riding on a goat, intersecting this great diagonal with a very strong horizontal element of the pitchfork that she carries. The dominant witches are sitting on the ground here. 3 of them all together. 1 in the back with her arms raised, and then these 2 sitting directly on the ground. They are making more diagonals. So the witch in the back with her arms like this, creating some diagonals. The witch in the front with her left arm extended out also. While the witch on the right here is essentially unlidding her pot and letting out all of this magnificent smoke. And the witches are surrounded by a variety of different objects. Now you might ask yourself, how would Green know what to include in this image about witches? Well, Pope Innocent VIII arranged for a book to be written on how to tell a witch from a normal person. This book is called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. The passages of this text gave insight to the occult lifestyle of the time. And Green is showing his witches with animals, bones, pitchforks, and a variety of other accoutrements that only witches would have. They have removed their clothing, so their real lives are no longer there. We have this hat here in the foreground to remind us that they were once cloaked. And then we have this fuzzy kitty cat right behind our main witch here, who is there to protect. He's looking off into the distance, out into the woods, to make sure no one's coming. We also have this nice triangular formation that all of the pitchforks are arranged in, and then that's where all the magic is essentially spewing forth from. So this is obviously a very powerful location. But because Hans Baldengrin is definitely a student of Albert Dürer, he makes sure to put his signature somewhere noticeable. And you can see his iconic HB hanging on this plaque here in the lower branch of the tree. Definitely a student of Dürer, but also quite talented himself. Our next artist is the last great German painter of the High Renaissance. Hans Holbein the Younger was born in 1497 and died in 1543. In his time as an artist, he managed to create a synthesis of German linear quality with Netherlandish love of elaborate details, rich patterns, and textures. Now, this image of Christ in the tomb from 1521 is quite striking. As we have seen throughout this lecture, German artists were not afraid to show the reality of pain and suffering. Holbein is certainly no exception. Here we are, inside the coffin with Jesus, and he is quite dead. His body has started to gray, and his ribs are becoming more obvious. The open wounds on his hands and feet are quite disgusting as they fester and start to rot. You can see, I'm going to show you a detail of his hand in just a second so we can look at the up-close personal view of the rotting, festering wound. But this is a life-size cadaver. Rigor mortis has set in. Christ's head is slightly back and turned, and his hair is draped over the linen sheet. And there are signs of previous movement, but now it's just still. And here we are looking and observing the slow decay of our Savior. Here we have the detail of the hand wound, and I'm sorry, he's flipping everyone off. But nonetheless, you can see, that the blood has stopped flowing and that it's all coagulated, essentially, and it's quite disgusting and realistic looking. Holbein was not simply known for his ability to create believable images of the dead. He became the court painter of Henry VIII in 1532. We all remember Henry as the man who had lots of wives and created the Church of England in order to get a divorce. Well, Holbein served as a special purpose for Henry. He not only painted the king, but also his prospective wives. Holbein also created and designed costumes for the king and many of his ladies. So this portrait of Henry from 1540 is quite famous. Now that you've seen it, you'll recognize it in lots of different internet memes that you'll come across. But that's beside the point. This portrait shows the king as a powerful force. Now his body is taking up the entirety of the picture plane, and he's dressed really nicely. Holbein has spared no detail on the king's costume. The luster that Holbein has captured in this garment is just like Jan van Eyck would have done. The way that Henry's arms are bent to show even more of the sleeve and how decorated the fabric is was no accident. Now let's talk about his face. He's framed quite nicely, his face is, between the arch of his hat and then the shape that his chain makes. Now, compared to the rest of him, his face is a little small because he's quite portly. So Holbein chose to frame him in this way to draw attention away from his gut, and so we could focus more on the king's dashing good looks. Now, Holbein had to make sure to portray the king as powerful, wealthy, and confident. He painted him numerous times, and does this at all costs. However, in 1543, Holbein dies of the plague and can no longer be the court painter for Henry VIII. One of my favorite Netherlandish painters to come out of the High Renaissance is Hieronymus Bosch. He was born sometime around 1450 in Hertogenbosch in the Netherlands. And we don't know a lot about Bosch, but we do know that he was more than likely trained by his father and uncle. Now, Hieronymus Bosch witnessed a huge fire in 1463 that will resurface in his famous triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delight. So here we have an overview of the entire piece. Really overwhelming, isn't it? There are bodies everywhere, doing things that don't look normal, living in these strange worlds where nothing looks like it's supposed to. I've supplied a link on Blackboard. There's a new online project that someone put together to explain almost anything that you could possibly want to know about in this painting. I don't have time to go over every last detail, but I do encourage you to visit the website and click around and learn some stuff. It's really quite interesting. However, we're going to start by looking at the left wing, and we're going to work our way across. So let's take a look at the left. Looking at the left wing, we can see that essentially we have this great high horizon line, and in the center we have an elegant fountain, and then in the foreground we have some figures, and then there's a bunch of different animals throughout the piece. This scene is much more calm than any of the other scenes. We are here in the Garden of Eden, and Eden is essentially centered around this really elegant fountain. But in the foreground is essentially that moment where God, who is here in the center, has already created Adam and just created Eve and is introducing them for the first time. Now Adam is laying here on the ground, but he's sitting upright and he's alert. And Eve seems very docile and a little, submissive, which is a good quality for a woman at this point. Behind Adam is the tree of knowledge. And essentially, throughout this piece, there are lots of hidden symbolism or hidden images that help us understand what's going on in Eden. So if you look at the detail of the fountain right here, you see these birds sitting on it. These are ravens, and ravens are an omen of death. They're a negative omen. And inside the hole here, we have an owl. The owl is nocturnal and is associated with witches and the devil. So the devil is lurking at all times while the scene of the creation is happening. Now let's look at the central panel. Looking out the central panel, this is the earthly realm. We're no longer safe in paradise. We are now free to take part in all the evil of the world, naked bodies as far as the eye can see, and they are mixed with giant pieces of fruit and oversized birds and oddly shaped buildings that resemble castles. Now, in the foreground here, we have a lot of things happening. But right here, remember the Netherlandish love of proverbs? Well, this is an illustration of a proverb. It's happiness in glass, how soon they pass. In the middle ground, we have this watering hole. It's quite frenzied, and there are humans riding animals, circling this pool. Perhaps it's the fountain of youth, perhaps not. Perhaps it's simply a place where these people have chosen to swim. And then at the top, we have 4 different castles sitting on this lake, while one is sitting in the middle of the lake. Now, the central castle is called the Tower of Adultery, and the 4 others are castles of vanity. So there are so many things happening inside the earthly realm that's so overwhelming. I think it's an accurate depiction of what humans struggle with on a daily basis, though. And even though it's painted hundreds of years ago, the temptations are still haunting us as a society. So while things don't necessarily fit into a context that we're familiar, at the same time, they still kind of reign, or they strike a chord, because some of these things are still things that we face on a daily basis. So go and explore the central panel at least on the website. The third panel is dedicated to hell. We had an image of perfection in the first panel. That perfection was destroyed by humans in the central one, and now they've been sent to hell, where they have to pay for their sin. So in the background of hell, at the top of the canvas, we see all these lights and smoke and fire. And Bosch was including the fire that he witnessed as a child in this piece. In the middle ground here, we have a very strange scene. We have an egg that is cracked open and seems to be growing out of tree trunks. People are occupying the inside space. And this is a reference to the alchemical egg, which was a symbol of death and rebirth. It's unfortunate these people were technically reborn in hell. The flat platform just above the egg is the platform for a bagpipe. And this is a traditional symbol of lust. Now the space underneath the flat disc is essentially quite intriguing to most people. Scholars believe it's actually Bosch's own self-portrait. Other than that, we can't really explain the meaning behind this. So that's a fairly decent assumption. Now, if you look in the foreground section, we have all these instruments and all these people, and then we have this bird that is sitting on a potty chair. And the potty chair was basically like your own internal, or a bathroom that you would have in your room or something. But this is the devil, and he is watching people be tortured elaborately, all while swallowing souls and expelling them from his body. All in all, these terrible traits from hell are quite intriguing. So again, please visit the website and get a little bit more in-depth analysis. Our last Netherlandish artist of the High Renaissance is Peter Bruegel the Elder. And he was born in 1525 and died in 1569. During the Reformation, there was an important figure named Erasmus of Rotterdam. And in 1500, Erasmus published his Adagia, which is a bunch of proverbs that contained hidden or double meanings. Bruegel used this text to inspire this image of Netherlandish proverbs from 1559. We have an outdoor setting full of 100 figures, and they are all doing activities to exemplify moral principles. Each thing illustrates some kind of proverb, but it's the negative side of it. So Bruegel, to make it a little easier, has color-coded some of the information in the image with blue and red. Red is a sin or arrogance, while blue is cheating and foolishness. So for example, the couple in the middle of the foreground here, she is wearing red while she put the blue cloak on her husband. And they are essentially, she is the sinner and he is the fool for believing her and saying that she's not an adulteress. So directly next to the couple, we have this guy who has a bunch of pigs, and he is dropping roses all over the ground. And this illustrates to cast pearls before swine. Seems like a waste of time, doesn't it? Directly on this side of the couple, behind them, are two ladies talking to each other. This is gossip. And as they stand and sit, they are holding instruments that are used to spin. Thus, they are spinning tales. Other fun ones included back here in the water scene with big fish eat little fish. And then to hold an eel by the tail. And a variety of other ones. There are so many proverbs represented here. I highly suggest doing some research on your own to find out about different things in this image. Now, Peter Bruegel lived during a very tense time of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. In this period, Spain controlled the Netherlands and added to the synthesis of classical imagery from Christian stories with moralizing and satirical material. The Proverbs seen here, this style of painting will eventually make its way into the Baroque style as soon as it comes in the 17th century. So you can see these moralizing characteristics and whatnot, they will remain and they will be used again. So stay tuned and pick up on the next lecture about the Baroque.